Welcome friends. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a sales table using only SQL. Now obviously it is true that I could give you a ready-made table in Excel to complete the project, but I want to show you some intricate details that concern SQL instead. Alright, so here take a look at this table that I've made. I'm going to make some basically sales data for the employees. Remember, in previous lessons in this section, we had a details view and we were able to enter employees, and we had a table for that, the employees table. Now in this table, we'll call this one the sales table. We'll store information on the sales of each employee as an example. So we are going to generate this table using a lot of SQL. Okay, keep that in mind. And again, I'm choosing that because obviously since you're in this class, you're interested in it as I am. I think it's kind of fascinating what you can do with your mind. All right, so I'm going to do this as follows. Notice this table has the employee ID column. The ID is like the individual record ID. That's why, as you can see, it begins at 1 and goes down, say, to 30. Okay, that's just the numbering of the records. All right, then employee ID is here because remember, in that other table, we have employees with IDs. And remember that in that table, because you can add records and you can delete them, there's no guarantee the employee ID will be a sequential quantity like 1, 2, 3. It could be 1, 4, and so on. So when I look here, take a look. I've got employee ID, and that goes this way, you see. I've got a column with employee IDs. And then I have the date sold, month only, and amount. What we need to do is take a look. I'm going to choose the first employee ID from the employees table, conceptually speaking, that is. And then I'm going to generate a record of sales information to go with it. And I'm going to, again, keep the ID fixed. I'm going to generate a record, keep the ID fixed, generate the next set of information, keep the ID fixed, get the next date sold, month only, amount, and so on. And I'm showing you this to illustrate something very important, that when we do this in SQL, because we have an employee ID block, we'll need nested while loops. So employee ID, as you can see, is 1, and then you've got some information next to each employee ID. And then we're going to have to switch to the next employee ID of 4, and then generate information for that block, you see? And then after that, we're going to have to grab the next employee ID of 5 down below. Where is that? Right here. You're going to switch over to the next employee ID and generate the next set of rows for that employee. So we're going to grab the employee ID using something called a cursor. And then once we've got the cursor grabbed, we'll generate a set of records for that employee ID. Then we'll grab the next employee ID, next set of records. Grab the next employee ID, next set of records. All right, let me close this though. Pull it down, that is. I'm going to make a new clear window and go from scratch here. I don't want to just show you the final code. As you can see, there's a lot of it. It has to be explained line by line so it's meaningful. All right, make a new clear window. Now, because I already have this table, as you've seen, I'm going to have to do some preliminary stuff just to get rid of it. So specifically, let me begin here. I'm going to type, first of all, drop table sales table. Okay? I want to make sure that doesn't exist on my system already. All right, so it did exist, so I was able to drop it. Good, that's the first stage. And let's create that table again. So I'm going to say the following. I will say create and then table and then sales table. And then I will say ID, integer identity, 1, 1, and then primary key, as you see here. We've seen this kind of line before. This is nothing new. All right, next stage, I just did Control-Shift-R to get rid of the red underlining from sales table. I'm going to type emp ID. And again, I want that because I want a connection between the employee ID, for example, from the employees table and this sales table. Okay, I want that for that reason. So obviously I could do, for example, joins and see Mary Castro with employee ID such and such. These are her sales. All right, so I'm going to say integer. Next stage, I'm going to say date sold, and then date. Next, I'm going to say month only, and then say varchar 20. But again, these are like January, February, March, April, and so on. You could probably just get away with 10 even. Make sure you're separating these with commas, and then I will say amount and money. Now, we don't have this data available anywhere, so we've got to make it ourselves using some code. So next comes kind of like the heart of what I'm going to show you. All right, so I hope you've got that, and let's take a look. So first stage is to do this. Take a look. I'm going to say declare emp ID and then cursor, and then cursor for, and then you specify a query the cursor represents. A cursor is just a mechanism, okay, that comes with SQL Server, for example, in SQL, where you can access each row of a result set individually. Declare emp ID cursor, that's a name I've made up. I'm going to say cursor and then for, and then you specify a query that it should, for example, represent row by row by row. It's a beautiful feature. It can be dangerous, but for our purposes, it accomplishes the job. I will say select and then emp ID from employees table as shown here. So make a cursor for the employees table. Remember now, because all I'm doing is selecting the employee ID from the employees table, if you think about it carefully enough, right? You see that? That means that emp ID cursor will give us row by row access to the employee IDs in the employees table. So the next stage is to do this. I'm going to say now declare and then add inner counter. And remember what I showed you previously. Let me see. Do I still have that down below? I do. Remember that we have employee ID 1. So we get that with the cursor. Once you have that gotten, you've got to now generate 10 records under that one ID. You see that? So the cursor takes care of getting the employee ID, but after that, we will need a variable that we can use to generate the records under that ID. So that's why I have this inner counter. When I say inner, that's what I mean. I mean the counter used to generate the records under each employee ID. All right, let me go back here and continue typing. So next stage, I've got the inner counter. I'm going to set that equal to an integer. I'm going to set the default value to 1. Next, I will say declare at, and then I will say emp ID, and then integer. And this variable I need because remember, we are going to get the employee ID using the cursor from the employees table. All right. So everything that is here for a very definite reason. So that we have that, I'm going to type open and then emp ID cursor. I'm going to open up the cursor. And remember the benefit. I can go through the results set of getting the employee IDs from the employees table row by row by row. Essentially, that's what it's allowing me to do, okay? Keep that in mind. So I'm going to type the following. I will say fetch and then next, and then from emp ID cursor into at emp ID. So what this will do for me, for example, is get the first ID from the cursor and save it over to this variable named emp ID. And I want to do that because remember in the results set, I need to first stick in the correct employee ID. And once I have it, then I can generate information that goes with it, you see? So here, I'm going to fetch it, and then I'm going to say this next. While at double, and then fetch status equals 0. Now what is this telling me? We're going to make the first outer loop. This is the loop that is necessary to ensure that the employee IDs are gone through properly. So you're going to grab each one, generate records, and this while loop on the outside, as you will see in a second, helps to ensure that we're going through the employee IDs properly. And it says fetch status equals 0. That simply means that everything has run well. That's all. Okay, that's like a code of 0 that has a specific meaning. And fetch status, hover your mouse over it, as you can see, is a global variable. So it's accessible anywhere. For our purposes, though, it means we're checking to make sure that fetch status is 0. That means everything is working well. Okay, next stage, I'm going to say begin and then end. And more than that, though, because remember the cursor, as you can see, is opened up above. I want to make sure that at the end, everything is closed. So type here as follows, close emp ID cursor. And then to emphasize some key points, I'm going to start indenting this information so it's a little neater. So highlight, hit tab, and indents. And then I'm going to indent those two also. I want to be clear that you're going to fetch the employee ID, save it into the employee ID variable, and once you have cut stage completed, then you will have an inner loop that will generate the records under that employee ID. So I will say the following. I will say while at inner counter say is less than or equal to 10 as an example, or whatever you want. You could generate 100 records, correct? Or 30 records, whatever you want, not important. All right, then I'm going to say again begin and end. I'm going to indent those two to indicate that they're subordinate this way. So what am I making here? Take a look. These are nested loops. This is one loop with its own begin end, and then this here is the other loop, the outer loop, with its begin and end also. So you can nest loops. All right, so within the begin and end, under inner counter less than or equal to 10, this is where you actually insert information into the table. And to accomplish that, this is what you'll do. We'll say insert into, say, sales table, like that. And then make the list of the fields that should receive information. So I'm going to say emp ID, next date sold, next month only, next amount. And then you need the actual values. So to accomplish that, I will say this. I will say values, and then you make a list of values. So I will say at employee ID. So I hope you see, remember that the cursor right here, fetch next from emp ID cursor into at emp ID, that's the connection, right, to the employees table. And then once you have that employee ID, you can insert that as a value into this new sales table. It's the linchpin of everything if you think about it. All right, so next stage I would say as follows here. I would say get date and then plus at inner counter. I'm typing that because if I just type get date, it's going to stick in the same date for every single record. Not interesting, right? That's not how things are usually. So by writing plus at inner counter, I'm helping to ensure that the date begins, say, from today and then tomorrow and then the next day, and next day, and so on. You see? You're growing the date by 1 day by saying plus at inner counter. So you're going through the days of November in this case. All right, make sure you separate things with commas properly. Next stage in the process, I will say now date name, and I'm going to say here month, comma, and then get date, and then again plus at inner counter. So what this is saying is get the date, add the counter value to it. You're going to get the date, add the inner counter value, and then keep in mind that you're going to use date name. That means extract the month from the date. So date name, then you put a month in there. You see that? It says date part and then month, which obviously means that very likely, I mean, could you type something else in there? You see how it's kind of pinkish too? And it says date part, day. Date part. It's a part of the date. All right, and then I'm going to say month. It might be useful, for example, to have that so you can summarize by months and so on, you see? All right, so with that in place, the next stage, I'm going to put a comma, and last I'm going to generate some random number that represents the sales amount. So it looks as shown here. And remember now, because we have an inner loop, or like that, we need to advance the counter on it, so we actually loop, and we don't get into an infinite loop, in other words. So to that, I'm going to say the following. I would say as follows. I would say set at inner counter equal to at inner counter plus 1. That takes care of the inner loop. Next stage in the process, take a look. Go between the ends and think about what will happen with the data now, okay? Once you've generated 10 records for the first employee ID, you want to resume that process for the next employee ID, and you want to do that so the inner counter is reset as an example, okay? I'm not saying you have to do it that way, but I want to explain to you the way I'm going to do it. So I'm going to reset the inner counter to its initial value of 1. So it's basically like saying begin for the next employee from also today or tomorrow. So I would say the following. I would say set at inner counter equal to 1. I'm resetting the inner counter. And then on top of it, once we've generated these records over here, the next stage in the process, naturally enough, will be to grab the next employee ID from the cursor. So I'm going to say fetch next from emp ID cursor and then into @emp ID. All right, I hope you've got all of that. I know it's a lot. So now let's take a look. And let's make sure that after the primary key, you put a comma. See, it's the little things that can get you. So put a comma after the primary key. All right, I'm going to drop this table one more time. I just want to do everything from scratch. Okay, make sure it's gone. Create it again. Okay, sales table. And then select the cursor. I'm going to try to run this cursor one time to see what happens. And I'm getting an error. Take a look down below and it says a cursor with that name already exists. So to fix that, put the following under close emp ID cursor. Type the allocate emp ID and then cursor. You have to be careful of the spelling. So let me just fix that. So DELALL and then OCATE. The allocate cursor. Get rid of the cursor and now you can run it. So if you encounter that error, you know what to do. When you're experimenting, it's obviously the case you have to run the same code multiple times. So deallocate the cursor, then you can run it again. All right, and now it says that everything has worked successfully. So it's confirmed by doing this. Go down and take a look inside the table. So select table, star, and I'm going to say from sales table, as shown here. Okay, let's take a look inside it now. Expand that panel. And that's working well in the sense that, as you can see, you've got the employee ID. You see? Now in my case, obviously I ran the cursor before. I had some data initially. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to drop the table one more time and show you completely from scratch. Execute that. Okay, deallocate the cursor. Get rid of it. Okay, make the table again. And then run the cursor from top to bottom. All right, you want to include the deallocate, just so in case you run it again, it's already deallocated. Execute it and take a look inside this table. All right, let's see here. And now we have records 1 through 30. Employee ID begins as 1 and goes down to 5. So everything is working nicely. We have the date sold, we have the month only, and the amount sold, and so on. Now, last stage, what you should do is pause the video, type up this code, and then try to break it by removing certain pieces of information and then running it and seeing what the error message is that results. What I mean by that is take a look. Imagine I do one simple thing. I take where it says set at inner counter equal to 1 and I just comment that out so it becomes disabled. And then I drop the table. I'm going to go from scratch every time with the table. And then I'm going to recreate the table and run the cursor again without that line. That's what I'm going to try to do, okay? So recreate the table. And then let's see, where's the next line here? You have to be super careful. This is so much at this point. Execute that and look at the output in the data. That looks like this. That's good. So now select the records from the table and look down below and notice we have only 10 records. And that is so simply because we have removed the functionality provided by this line right here. So this is what I mean. Disable, run, observe the result, and then put back as shown. One more time. Imagine I take this line right here and I comment that out and I go through the whole process again, right? Drop the table, deallocate the cursor, make sure it's deallocated. All right, create the table again. And now take a look. What happens, I've just removed this one line where I'm fetching the next employee ID from the cursor, that is, okay, into the employee ID variable. So imagine I try to run this. Hit execute. And look on the bottom of the yellow status bar. It says executing query and it's not ending. We have entered an infinite loop. So let me terminate that. So I hope that gives you a stronger sense of why this is necessary. All right, so what I'm going to do is just drop the table. Because remember, once you make an infinite loop, take a look inside the table. Once you start making an infinite loop, right, it just runs, and you see how many records it starts generating. And pretty soon you would run out of space on your drive, correct? You crash your computer, for example. This generated within a few seconds 26,000 records, you see? So that's why this fetch next from the cursor is needed. I'm going to drop the table. I'm going to recreate it. I want to make sure we live off in a consistent state. All right, deallocate the cursor. And then just run this one more time. All right, let me take a look inside the table again. And let's see. It should go from 1 to 30, and that is where we want to be, 1 to 30, okay? There you go. So this is all of the code from top to bottom. I know this is more advanced. There's a lot happening here just to generate some relatively simple effects. But again, computers are not smart. They're smart only to the extent that you tell them what to do. All right, this is as small as I can make it, or rather as big as I can make it, so it all still fits from top to bottom. Of course, I do have it under lesson resources also. And I'll see you in the next one.